The Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live. Another day, another episode of the Winter Latina Show. Nina, how are you doing? You have now an on air showing up on your back.
I know, you could see two letters of the on air. Well, no, maybe right now you can see more than two letters. But yeah, I'm coming from real winter. It's about -20 where I am. Marcelo, have you ever experienced -20 Celsius?
Nope.
No.
But yeah, after below -5 Celsius, it has a fantastic feeling. I don't know what changes there, but it has a fantastic feeling.
What are you doing when it's lower than -5?
I don't know, just walking around, freezing, but I don't know. It's just different. It's warmer than between -5 and 5. I don't know.
Interesting. Maybe it's your body adjusting to this temperature. Yeah, walking dogs at 6 o'clock in the morning in -20 with a wind chill is not very fun. And I used to live in a colder place, so I shouldn't be complaining about it. And of course, today, one of our two experts is also coming from a colder place. So we'll talk about the interesting subject of the weather as soon as we bring them on. Yeah, so welcome to another fun-filled installment of the Winter Latina Show, where we talk about death and destruction with a little bit of humor. And today we're going to cover a highly requested topic, which is the Winter War, also known as the Russo-Finnish War or the Soviet-Finnish War. Not only is this topic requested, but it's also something that's been brought up by, let's call them social media activists in the past few years since the escalation in the war in Ukraine. And it's something that, in my opinion, has been part of Western propaganda. So if I go onto a major Western English language website like history.com to see the description of this particular military conflict, 1939, 1940, so right before the Great Patriotic War and during World War II, we see the way that this conflict is being portrayed as tiny nation of Finland is standing up to the giant, awful, evil communists of the Soviet Union. They talk about the poor military performance of the Red Army. They talk about the impact that this poor military performance of the Red Army had on the perception of the Red Army in World War II. And basically the entire description is very black and white. And so I wanted to see whether we can sort of, it sounds very trivial, right? Separating fact from fiction, but it would be really interesting to examine this topic in more detail and basically talk about how this particular conflict is, portrayed in the public. Obviously, this is the educated public. I don't think the average man on the street knows about the Winter War of the previous century, but it's certainly something that pops up in Western propaganda. And we also want to know what actually happened. Was the situation really this black and white? Or is there some kind of an ideological component for these historians, these Western historians, these major websites to describe it in such a black and white way? And so for this purpose, we have not one, but two guest experts. One of them is, I think, literally our initial first guest for this particular format. His name is Alexander Shmidke. He is, in my opinion, a historian in his own right. He is a tour guide and a specialist on the siege of Leningrad. He lives in St. Petersburg, Russia. He's a wealth of information. And our other expert is the guest that we had recently. His name is Andrej Ćirić. I'm pronouncing his name with a Russian accent, so bear with me. He is coming to the show from Serbia. We've had him recently to discuss the war in Ukraine, and he is an anthropologist, but he's also a military affairs specialist. So hopefully this particular format will work. Marcelo, let's please bring them both on.
Yeah, and everybody, please excuse us because this is the first time we're having two guests at the same time. And you mentioned something that I think is very interesting to point out. Yeah, exactly. Alexander was the first guest that we had on this format, perhaps even the first guest on the first season of Winter Latina. And this is the second episode, so basically the beginning of the Winter Latina show. And it looks like a cycle closing in together, from the beginning to the end of the first season. Very interesting.
Well, it was literally to discuss the anniversary of the end of the siege of Leningrad, which last year was the 80th anniversary, 1944, 2024. And I think we're actually here around the same time. We're in January 22nd, right? The anniversary is on the 27th. So it literally has been almost exactly a year. Exactly.
So, and I will probably be very quiet today because until very recently I didn't even knew this war had happened. Recently, I mean about 2 years ago. But I have some very interesting facts that perhaps will portray this together with the Paraguayan War with Brazil, and I will probably say something at some point, just not to be so quiet all the time. Without further ado, let's bring our guests to the screen, and I hope everything works because this is the first time we're having two guests. And yeah, they are on the screen. It worked.
Perfect.
Yay.
Well, welcome everyone. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves briefly? So Alexander, why don't you go first? If there's anything you'd like to add, I linked your website as well if people want to visit it. But if there's anything else you'd like the guests to know about you.
Well, hello, my name is Alexander. I work as a tour guide in St. Petersburg, and I do tours on the siege of Leningrad and the Great Patriotic War, and also on the Winter War, the war between the Soviet Union and Finland. I started getting interested in this whole Soviet and Russian-Finnish relations thing maybe like 5-7 years ago. And these controversies, this animosity goes way deeper than people tend to think. So it's rooted in the Middle Ages, well, I don't know if we're going to start the whole conversation from so far away, but I would just like to say that one of the main issues in discussing the legacy of the Winter War in Russia is the way the memory of the war was preserved in the post-war era, in the starting from the 1950s all the way up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It started changing radically just a few years ago, and I'll probably later explain why. But just the main thing is that is not the main problem for historians is not so much as the war itself, but the way the memory of this war was preserved.
Yeah, we're definitely going to discuss this topic in the end. So why don't we have Andrej introduce himself for those who've missed his previous broadcast?
You're muted, Nina.
Why don't we?
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Man.
Yeah, we hear you all the time.
Okay. Can you hear me, Marcelo? Because it looks like my mic is going.
Alexander, I hear him fine.
Yeah, I can hear everyone.
Marcelo, can you hear?
No, I'm sorry. I was muted.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Someone here in the chat said thank you for your patience.
So why don't we have Andrej introduce himself to those who've missed the previous broadcast, and then we'll get started. We'll briefly talk about the pre-Soviet period just for literally a couple of minutes, just to set the context, and then we'll get into sort of the details of the situation. So let's have you introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Andrej Ćirić. I'm an anthropologist by trade, but I'm sort of 1 foot in military affairs, so my attention is divided between different things. And I work in a museum of Belgrade. Otherwise, So that's about it.
So we have two people who have museum connections, right, in St. Petersburg and Belgrade. So why don't we have Alexander start with this topic? Let's really briefly discuss the way that Finland ended up as part of the Russian Empire, maybe very briefly, the relationship between Sweden and Russia, and the type of status that Finland had in the Russian Empire prior to the 1917 revolution.
Okay. So basically, the way Finland appeared was this Swedish conquest. First of all, Swedish and Novgorodian conquest. So basically, Russia was a highly fractured country in the 10th, 11th century. And the Novgorodian Republic expanded to the north, while the Swedes expanded to the east, and their interests clashed on the modern-day territory of Finland. It was split in two parts between Novgorod and Sweden back in the 14th century. Then a lot of different wars happened, and eventually Sweden gained control of the entire Finland, modern-day territory of Finland, and even the territory where St. Petersburg lies now. But Peter the Great reconquered this area, and he also conquered the Swedish town of Viborg, which is one of the central points in discussing like the history of the Winter War. So the Viborg or Viborg province became part of the Russian Empire in 1721, and it remained part of the Russian Empire all the way up to 1811. The reason why it changed hands is that in 1809, Russia fought a war between Sweden, against Sweden. The reason for this war was the Tilsit peace agreement between the Emperor Alexander and Napoleon, basically pledged not to interfere in any wars or like any kind of business Russia would have with Sweden, which basically allowed Russia to conquer the modern-day territory of Finland from Sweden, and it immediately became the Grand Duchy of Finland. The Emperor Alexander decided it would be a nice thing to do to present the Viborg province to Finland as well as a kind of a gift, and also a lot of Finns lived in these territories, so he saw that by putting Finns next to the Finns would be a good thing, and it would be a kind of a gesture of appeasement for the Finns, who were probably not that happy about joining the Russian Empire, some of them. But in fact, when Finland became part of the Russian Empire, the Emperor Alexander gave them very broad autonomy. They de facto became a state within a state. The Emperor Alexander II basically expanded this autonomy. So Finland became a de facto independent state, so it managed its own finances. It only didn't have its own army, but as for all other basically signs, symbols, and all the kind of all the elements which make a state, it had them. So it had its own financial system, it had its own border between Russia and Finland. So although Finland was part of the Russian Empire, it had its own like customs border. So Russian merchants, for example, had to pay their like customs duties, and they had to trade. They were forced to trade in Finland with basically forced to trade with Finland at worse conditions than the Finnish merchants themselves. And eventually, in the late 19th century, the Emperor Alexander III decided to put an end to this broad autonomy, because he said that Finland, like the Finnish parliament, and Finland was granted a constitution by the Emperor Alexander I. The Finns demanded money for their infrastructural projects, while they did not send any money to the state treasury, which was bit too much, and Finland was exempt from military service. I mean, the Finnish men, and he thought that it was a bit too much for there was too much freedom for this little semi-autonomous state within the Russian Empire to enjoy. And he decided to clamp down on this and started a policy of Russification, which naturally met protests in Finland. And Finnish student, for example, assassinated the Governor General of Finland, Bobrikov, in 1905. This was at the height of the first Russian Revolution. And eventually, Finland was slowly growing its own independence. So it had all the institutions that would be essential for an independent country. But the only thing it didn't have was independence. And the way Finland was tied to the Russian Empire, legally speaking, is that it was a Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. It was tied to Russia by the personal union of the Grand Duke of Finland to the Russian Tsar. And conveniently enough, the Russian Tsar had the title of the Grand Duke of Finland. So basically, the Tsar tied, as the Grand Duke of Finland, tied Finland to himself as the Tsar of Russia. I mean, it's all these feudal things that were quite common in Europe back in the day. And in 1917, the Tsar abdicated, and legally speaking, well, Finland lost any rationale to become part of, to be a part of Russia. But the Finns did not want to hasten things. They decided to basically sit and wait because there was a lot of upheaval in Russia. There was the First World War going on, and formally they remained part of Russia. But then the Bolsheviks came, and Lenin decided to grant the Finns their independence because, after the October Revolution, there was totally no reason for Finland to kind of remain part of Russia. The Finns were still quite cautious, and the main reason why Lenin granted them independence was that Finland had a very strong socialist party. So it was a kind of a calculated combination that Lenin wanted to make. So basically, he wanted to appease the nationalist element within the Finnish Socialist Democratic Party, to assure them of the kind of the sincerity of the Bolsheviks' intentions to have no countries, no borders, because some of the people in the Finnish Socialist Party were cautious about the Russians' intentions. They thought that probably the Bolsheviks are imperialist at heart, and they might continue suppressing the Finnish nation. And Lenin said no. He decided to make it like that. We grant you independence. So basically, you're an independent country. We have no imperialist aspirations as Russians, as you can see, because we granted you this independence. And after that, the Finns, he hoped that there would be a revolution in Finland because of this very strong socialist party. And after this revolution, there would be the worldwide revolution, and all countries would merge together in one huge communist state. At least that was the plan. And it kind of worked. It partly worked because the Finns the Red Finns started their revolution in January 1918. And almost immediately after this revolution, a commission was gathered, a commission of the Finnish Red representatives and the Bolshevik representatives, which discussed the future border between the Bolshevik state, the Bolshevik Russia, and Finland. And even back then, even in 1917, in December 1917, when Lenin granted them independence, he realized that this situation with the border, I mean, the area where the border passed was extremely close to Petrograd. I mean, the capital of the Russian Empire, which is St. Petersburg now. And he thought that this whole situation was untenable. He wanted to move the border. Well, naturally, in the future, these old borders would vanish. But for the time being, he realized that it was too precariously close. The border between Russia and Finland was only 29 or 30 kilometers from the Smolny. The Smolny Palace was the seat of the Bolshevik government in Petrograd, St. Petersburg at the time. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks moved to Moscow, but back then, I mean, like the war theoretically could have started with an artillery shell from some long-range gun, like flying from the Finnish territory and hitting the center of the Soviet government. Well, the commission kind of dragged feet. I don't know why. They did not come to any conclusion, and then there was the civil war. It started in January 1918 and ended with the victory of the Finnish Whites. Well, the Finnish Reds fled to the Soviet Union, well, those who could. And of course, there could be no negotiations on the border, and there was a lot of hostility between, well, naturally, a lot of hostility between Russia and Finland after 1918. In 1919, the Finns attempted a number of expeditions into Russia, which they claimed were not sponsored by the Finnish government. But actually, they managed to occupy pretty big areas of the country. They were not formally annexed to Finland, but it was established that the Finnish government, for example, sponsored the local illegitimate governments and de facto supported them. And it's hard to imagine that the Finnish, all these Finnish officers could procure such enormous amounts of ammunition and weapons to be just pure volunteers. And this lasted until 1921, until the peace treaty of Tartu was signed, and between the Soviet Union and Finland, the Reds managed to suppress these governments and establish Soviet power on these territories of Eastern Karelia. But there was a curious note written by Mannerheim back in 1918 when he made an address to the people when the civil war ended. He said that he would not put his sword back in the scabbards until the last Bolshevik bandits would be expelled from the territory of Eastern Karelia. Here I have to remind you that the Eastern Karelia never belonged to either Finland or Sweden when Finland was part of Sweden. So the reason why the Finns expanded is that when a young nation kind of awakens with its young nationalism, it immediately acquires a huge appetite. And the Finnish Whites decided that they deserved not just the territory which was the Grand Duchy of Finland, but their mission, their destiny was to unite all the kinship folk of the Finns, of the Finnish-related kinship folk, which included Karelians. While the Karelians who lived in Eastern Karelia predominantly were Russian Orthodox. They were baptized back in the days of Novgorod, like back in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century. So they, when the Finns invaded, they met rather lukewarm support from the Karelians. Many of them were not happy about the Bolsheviks, but for the political reasons, not so much because of the nationalist reasons. And that's how it was. Throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, the relations between the Soviet Union and Finland were, well, they were pretty much like between Western and Eastern Germany, in a way. So basically, and the border between Finland and the Soviet Union was pretty much it was very similar to what was in East and West Berlin. So it was a place where spies got through all the time, where there were occasional shellings and shootings. It was like basically a very restless border. And this is the general historical context, which led up to the Winter War, to the rise of Hitler. But I guess the other guests would also like to have a word.
Thank you for that. And for those who don't know, I think we want to clarify who Mannerheim was, but maybe we can briefly mention him now. And then I'd like Andrej to talk about the transition from the 20s to the 30s, the general geopolitical situation that impacted the Soviet Union and Finland. But Sasha, do you want to wrap up Mannerheim a little bit before we talk about his role in the Winter War and also World War II?
Okay, just very briefly. So he was an officer in the Russian Imperial Army. He went on several expeditions to Central Asia and delivered some valuable intelligence to the Tsarist general headquarters. And he served in the First World War. And when the Finnish Civil War started, he was the commander-in-chief of the Finnish Whites. And he was basically brushed aside after the Finnish Civil War because of the political situation, and he basically stayed away from political matters all the way up to the late 1930s. So that was right after the Finnish Civil War, but he became like a national symbol in a way, a national symbol for the whites, because for the winning side, and well, I guess that delegates would also like to have a word.
Yeah, so it's an interesting transition from going from this, respected Russian imperial officer of Finnish descent to basically fighting Russia for much of his life after the Russian Revolution. Okay, now we're gonna go to Andrej. If you want to sort of wrap up the 20s and go into the 30s, however this works for you. Let's talk about this period.
First of all, I would have to correct you. He is not of Finnish descent. He was actually of the German, Baltic German descent, like so many most prominent Russian officers in 19th and 20th century. He was actually, his family was settled, I think, sometimes in 17th century, if I'm not mistaken, and then Swedish controlled Finland, and there is a whole colony of the Swedes still living there, who are more or less the privileged minority. They have extra privileges within Finland, yet still, and they're more or less running the course of the country, just like they did 300 years ago, like sort of a neo-nobility of sorts. Now, he was coming from this feudal background, and again, as so many brilliant Russian imperial officers who were actually of Germanic or even Swedish or Scottish descent, but he was loyal. He was loyal to the throne, and he sort of almost accidentally ended up as the leader of Finland. He didn't even know the Finnish language, so when he became the marshal of Finland, he didn't know the language of the country he was essentially running. So it's one of those curiosities which stem from those multi-ethnic empires once they start falling apart. Well, anyhow, during the 1930s, everybody was aware that the next big war is coming, Stalin most of all. So the whole process of the Petoletkas, the 5-year plans of development of the Soviet Union was specifically geared toward preparation for the next big war, industrial war, and the whole shifting of borders were sort of a preparation for this. So let's not go too much into mid-1930s, but by 1939, after the Soviet proposals to the various Western and mid European governments to form a common front against Hitler's Germany failed, then they made a deal with the Germans themselves. It is the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. And Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement among other things, there was a secret clause within it, which divided the spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, which meant that Finland was given back, metaphorically speaking, as a sphere of influence to the Soviet Union. So it was seen as a green light to sort of assert more forceful threat to this. Now, as far as I'm aware, there wasn't like a idea initially, at least, to sort of occupy Finland. And this is one of those things which are in the West deliberately misconstructed. There is this, just like in Ukraine today, like there's a lot of these similarities which will pop up as we go along. That allegedly the idea was to occupy entirety of Finland, but the Finns fought back and Soviet attempts failed. This was not the case. Soviet original idea was sort of just to push the border further on and to establish some lines of indirect control of the Finnish government. Similar thing happened in the Baltic states. very, very similar. So in Baltic states, Red Army sort of entered. It was given agreement to set up military bases, and only in 1940, so the next year, there was a gradual incorporation of Baltic states back into the, well, not back to Soviet Union, but to post-imperial Russian space. Same thing happened about the same time with Bessarabia, with Moldavia, what's today. So this was the attempt to sort of tread lightly from the Moscow and not to provoke official like a war. This wasn't the intention, not to occupy entire Finland, but simply to put control on a strategic points, mostly in the Baltic Sea. Now, Finns were, I don't think Finnish government was aware of this secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, that they were sort of, well, sold down the river by the Germans, whom they put their their fate into, yeah? So, and there was also one of the most important demands from the Russian government was that Finland would cut any collaboration with the Germany, to stop buying German weapons and things like that. Now, this goes back to the 1919 war and the old Jäger movement. Jägers were Finnish volunteers who fought with the German units in the closing months of the closing year of the First World War, and this was this legacy which was quite important in interwar years. So there was this strong bond between the remnants of the German Reichswehr, now which became obviously Wehrmacht later on, and Finland. And Finns were sort of seeking protection by the Germany in late 1930s in case of the war with the Soviet Union, which was part of the wider war which everybody was gearing up for. I mean, in late 1930s, everybody knew it was just a matter of time when the war will break out. So, and of course, all those agreements were, strictly speaking, unprincipled from all sides. Whomever made those agreements, there was no serious goodwill to honor them. Whether they were between Germans and the Soviets, the Anglo-French and the Poles, they weren't really worth the paper they were written into. So everybody was just gearing up and preparing for the first stage of operations. So apparently, I mean, I can, if you put yourself in a Finnish government's position, you can understand why they declined these initial proposals, which weren't really all that terrible. I mean, initially at least, the Soviets didn't demand entire occupation of the country, or even the permanent bases in the interior of Finland. What they wanted was just to push the border away to get the city of Viborg and to gain some access to strategic islands in the Baltic Sea. They were also offering compensation in East Karelia, so it wasn't really a bad deal, you know, as those things tend to go, because it wasn't like the Finns wouldn't get anything in return. They would get East Karelia, and it was much larger territory which was offered as a compensation. On the other hand, no sovereign government, if you put yourself in their shoes, could really accept such pressure, and they couldn't trade their sovereign territory. So there was that. And apparently Mannerheim also was quite cautious about this position that the Finnish government took. He was well aware that Finland wouldn't really have a serious fighting chance against the Soviets. So he was advocating for a more reasonable approach, so to speak, at least to buy time. He didn't know that the Germans would not support them, but this was kind of their strategic line of thinking. Anyway, Finnish army was totally out of its depth. It had, I think, only about 150,000 people all in all at the beginning. Later on, they mobilized additional troops, so they reached maybe about 180 to 200,000 in maximum outlook. But initially, it was like not a really peer competitor. However, they did have one or two major advantages. First of all, they managed to build a so-called Mannerheim line, which is fortified defense line across the Karelian isthmus, which was heavily fortified. It wasn't fortified to the extent that, I don't know, Maginot Line or some other European major lines which were built in the interwar years of war, but it was still formidable enough. and their home terrain was quite defensible because, of course, as anybody familiar with this geography knows, there's a lot of heavily forested areas, a lot of lakes and small rivers intersecting all of this. So a very small number of actual roads. So logistics is very limited, and it favors the defender with precisely the kind of military that Finns did have. Small light infantry, highly mobile units who could operate in such terrain. Now, this particular line of approach towards Leningrad was heavily dependent. However, there was this divergence of strategies in Soviet Union how to approach all of this in case Finland sort of decides to reject demands. So what it did was the worst of both possible solutions which were on the table. They decided to both frontally attack Mannerheim line, but without proper force concentration. And on the other hand, they advanced through to the other parts of the border in Karelia and further up north towards the Arctic Sea, but with improper logistical preparations. So, but now we are entering into the war phase. So maybe Alexander would take off on it.
Well, I have two clarification questions. The first question is, if you could mention the specific cities from which the Soviet government was trying to move the border from. Are we talking about Leningrad? Are we talking about Murmansk? And my second question is, I went a little bit down the rabbit hole of the Mannerheim line, and I read that it wasn't quite as amazing as it's believed by some to be, but it fit Finland to really hype it up for patriotic reasons, and it fit the Soviet Union to hype it up to show how difficult it was to actually penetrate. So it kind of fit both sides to really make it seem like it was more amazing than it was. So I don't know which one of you, Andrej, do you want to wrap this one up, or should we go to?
Yeah, city of Viborg was the most important one of the cities actually which were in question. But also the exit to the Arctic Sea was also questionable. And yes, Mannerheim line wasn't really all that formidable in itself. And as I said, it wasn't in the same category as West Wall, German West Wall, which is built towards the French border, or marginal line, or I don't know, fortifications that also French did towards Italy, or even the Czechoslovakian defense lines towards Germany. But it was formidable enough that it couldn't be just penetrated easily. You'd actually have to stop and engage it, like frontally. And there was no easy way to outmaneuver it because it's limited amount of territory which it covered between lakes and the sea, Baltic Sea. So you didn't really have a choice but actually to frontally go through it.
That makes sense. Thank you. Alexandra, do you want to talk about the war, the beginning of the war from the Soviet perspective or from the Russian perspective? You talked about a little bit about the changes in historiography as well. So maybe this would be a good time to mention those if it's applicable.
Well, speaking of the very beginning of the war, it was initially thought to be a cakewalk. I think there can hardly be any arguments about this, because when the Soviet army moved, they only used the forces of the Leningrad military district. So they did not assemble any big force, and they did not have any significant numerical superiority of the Finns in the first months of the conflict, and which tells you something that's it's entirely possible that the Soviet government expected the Finns to fold within a few days, just after realizing the impossibility of fighting with the entire Soviet Union. So just moving the forces close to the Mannerheim line was thought to be like a persuasive gesture enough to make them sign a peace agreement or agree with concede with all the demands. When initially, naturally the offensive progressed rather successfully for the first few weeks. For the first few days, up to a week. But when the Russian troops and the Soviet troops advanced along the four fields towards the Mannerheim line itself. One of the biggest debacles of the war was in the area of the Taipale River, where the Soviet troops which reached this river did not even have artillery that could be dragged up to them, because the forest roads that they had to advance along were barely good enough to allow one or two peasants' carts to drive by, because they were extremely narrow. And there were enormous traffic jams on these roads, and the artillery lagged far behind. So imagine forcing a river without any artillery support, but that's exactly what they did. And it led to horrendous casualties. The forward troops were kind of followed by a group of Soviet writers and poets and journalists, who were meant to record the victorious pace of the Red Army into Finland, and what they saw was probably not fit for print. The famous poem by Alexander Twardowski, "The River Crossing," it was every Soviet schoolboy read this poem, and it's still very well known in Russia. It was written after witnessing the river crossing at Taipale, that's to the north of Leningrad. When Soviet troops boarded quickly made rafts and rubber boats, and they were mowed down by the hundreds by Finnish machine gun fire. And this was the first place where the first massive reality check. When the Soviet troops approached the Mannerheim line itself, that was about the 7th, 8th, 9th of December. They made some probing attacks, then they tried several offensives. There was a huge offensive, the Finns called the Christmas offensive, sometime around the 20th of December, which failed with huge casualties. And it was only after this failed offensive in early January, when the Red Army finally seized these fruitless frontal attacks against very heavily fortified Finnish positions, and they switched to preparing the grounds for preparing the intelligence, preparing the grounds for a massive artillery offensive. But before I get to this, I would like to mention that in the first days, on the 3rd or the 4th of December, the first town that was captured by the Red Army was the town of Terioki, which is Zelenogorsk nowadays. And after capturing the first town of note, because all the other places that the Red Army were captured were just small villages, Stalin decreed that he would only since the liberation of this town, he would only speak to the official and the legitimate government of Finland. And the new Finnish government was created. Its leader was Otto Kuusinen. He used to be a party functionary in the Finnish Socialist Democratic Party back in 1918. And he was one of the few Red Finns, top-rated Red Finns, who survived the purges in the late 1930s. A new government was established. It was called the Terioki government, and it basically claimed to speak on behalf of the entire Finland. In the end of December, when the massive offensive failed, all news of this government just suddenly ceased. So there was it was never mentioned in the press. Stalin never mentioned it. It just vanished without a trace. Even modern day historians cannot find the exact papers or decrees or whatever documents that can be related to this government, which is kind of curious. But that's it. So you asked me to tell about the first weeks or the first phase of the war. Here you are.
Thank you. Andrej, do you want to talk a little bit more about military operations? And I also have a question for both of you or either one of you. Basically, we want to think about this particular conflict more generally, and we want to address the question as to whether it's its own localized conflict or whether it should be considered part of World War II, as some historians do. I think another example that's usually mentioned in this particular context is the battle that took place in Mongolia in 1939 between the Soviet Union, Japan, the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol. And so some people consider that to be a localized conflict, and others consider it to be a part of World War II. So I kind of want to address this after we talk a little bit more about military operations. So why don't we do it in this order if possible? So Andrej, do you want to talk a little bit more about military operations?
Well, I won't dwell too much on it. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Or do you want to
Okay.
address my? Would you rather address my question?
Well, I'll address your question. As far as I'm concerned, the Second World War didn't start in 1939. It started back in 1936. So, in China, and you could also claim that Spanish Civil War was also part of the Second World War. I mean, all these various conflicts happening also in Abyssinia and East Africa, all these conflicts were sort of a part of the larger conflict. They were just gearing up for it. It was just a matter of time when it will actually accelerate and explode. So choosing the 1st of September of 1939 as the official date of the Second World War is pretty arbitrary. It's pretty Eurocentric in a sense. It is the date when the major European powers declared war on each other, but the war was already there for a couple of years before that. So yes, I would definitely treat it as part of the Second World War in this little bit wider sense of it. Also, as I said, I wouldn't dwell too much on details because it's not really that interesting, actually. What happened was that Soviet army was in interwar years, and this also played very good at Khalkhin-Gol. It was highly modernized and highly motorized formation. So there was this whole concept of deep battle and penetrations and rapid movements. And also it played pretty well in the Eastern Poland, when, according to Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, Soviet Union entered its ex-Russian, now it's East Belrussia and the Western Ukraine territories. Of course, it wasn't like a serious battles being fought there, because Polish army was already being defeated on the western side of the frontier. Essentially, the whole battle structure collapsed by this point. This is 17th, 18th September of 39. And also they were under orders, official orders, not to give resistance to Red Army. Although this did not really happen universally. At some places, Polish units did fight back. But all in all, it was pretty successful, high tempo operations with deep advances, rapid advances. So it was like a very, very good performance in this context, just as it was against the Japanese. I mean, Khalkhin-Gol and also previous combat on Amur River, they were, I mean, in interwar years, this was the best performing combat of any participant in any war. They literally whacked the floor with the Japanese. So this probably led to a little bit of a cockiness in Stavka. They, as Alexander said, they didn't really expect that there would be serious resistance. They sort of just expected that they will roll over and that Finns will not fight back. There was also apparently expectations that remaining communists will stage the uprising, which will facilitate this takeover of power. So there won't really be any serious fighting. They will stage sabotages in the Finnish military and all this. However, this obviously didn't really happen because, well, first of all, Finland was, as Alexander said, mostly drained of the actual communists. All of them, there was also so-called white terror against them in the aftermath of the Finnish Civil War. So whomever was harboring communist sympathies was inclined to run over to Soviet Union and find shelter there. Now, there were still some residual communists, but they were politically marginalized. They didn't really have much of the impact that was probably desired. There were additional socialists, well, social democrats of sorts, but they were in line with the main political threat in Finland, which, I mean, Soviet Union called them fascists, which wasn't really like the case. Finland was a democratic country in those days, so it was more of a demagogical, rhetorical positioning. However, of course, there was this a legacy of collaboration with the Germans from 1918 and 1919. So there was that. There were obvious sympathies. But then again, one would have to sort of talk about the perception of different ideologies in interwar years, and it's very complicated issue. So it's not the topic of this particular show. Anyhow, this failed to materialize, and I think there is a very strong analogy, one of the many different analogies, with events of 2022, because it's pretty clear that Russian, I wouldn't even call it a battle plan, but political expectation of when the special military operations started was very similar. That the very act of showing up in force will trigger the internal transformation in first 1939 in Finland and in 2022 in Ukraine, which failed to materialize. And it's probably a little bit of a bad reading of the situation, a little bit of wishful thinking, maybe poor intelligence. And then after initial setbacks, there was this regrouping, bringing up reserves, and then just pushing through. I mean, this is a very, very similar developing line, both in the winter war and in what is currently happening in Ukraine for the last 2.5, 3 years.
Although, to correct some of the people in my chat, no Russian official actually said Kiev in 3 days. This is Western propaganda. This is something that does exist in popular culture. So in that sense, perhaps the idea of marching in and getting the desired result quickly may be correct. However, I think that idea also comes from thinking of more like an American style invasion, let's say of Iraq, of where Americans are not really concerned about civilian casualties. And that's obviously not what happened in Ukraine. So yes, to clarify that the whole Kiev in 3 days is something that's been disseminated by the Western media and politicians who were obviously seeking to achieve a particular result. So I'm going to pose the same question to you, Alexander, about whether or not you view this conflict as its own localized issue or part of World War II, and also if you want to talk a little bit more about the end of the Winter War.
Well, it's a rather complex question, in fact, because on one hand, it was the final resolution of the so-called time bomb that was placed by Alexander I, who basically gave this whole province to Finland as a gift. Otherwise, well, it's hard for me to imagine that the Soviet Union would have really made any claims to any other Finnish territory, because it was naturally, it was essentially the issue of security for Leningrad, the second largest city in the Soviet Union and a major center of industry, where something like up to a third of military industrial might of the Soviet Union was concentrated. So it was completely unacceptable for the Soviet Union, completely unacceptable and completely crazy for the Soviet Union to allow the border to stay that close in the situation that unfolded in 1939, because with the rise of Hitler, after the Munich agreements especially, Stalin realized that the Western countries would happily sit and wait until Hitler would expand further to the east. And he realized that he needed to basically strike a deal with him. And in this whole international context, when Hitler was actively trying to gear up his army for the invasion towards the east, and that's how Stalin saw the whole situation. Having a border with Finland that close, and Finland was known to have certain pro-German sympathies. I wouldn't say that there was a very strong pro-German grouping in Finland, like in the Finnish elite circles, but definitely it was viewed as a potential ally of either Germany or England or France. In any case, it was seen as a major, as a very hostile country to the Soviet Union, and as I already explained, that having a a border with such an extremely hostile country right next to like a major industrial center and political center. It was completely unacceptable. So it was those things that collided. You know, it's a complex plot. You can't just name one single reason for the beginning of the war, but I think that's where the general political situation of the Second World War that started, as my colleague had mentioned earlier, than 1939. That's definitely well, maybe future historians will have to come to another consensus and say that it started way before 1939. But in this context, so basically the heating of this political situation, the exacerbation of this political situation, it prompted the resolution of local unresolved conflicts. They just started popping up like everywhere. And Finland was a pretty good case of such a local conflict that had to be immediately resolved in the general political context. Speaking of the second phase of the war, the Soviet Union finally realized that it was not going to win the war by the force at hand, and it started mobilizing its resources, its reserves, dragging heavy artillery to the front line. Because initially there was very little like heavy artillery that could like damage Finnish bunkers in the first place, and which led to such massive casualties. They started very like cautiously and very meticulously reconnoitering Finnish bunker positions. Started mapping them precisely because they were very like well camouflaged, like to begin with. They started dragging this heavy artillery and like shelling it every day, like massively. It was in a way it was similar to World War I, you know, like by this like all these massive daily shellings. Then they started storming these bunkers, destroying these bunkers by specially created assault groups. Like they destroyed them one after another. And like they started these preparations back in like January. In early February, they managed to destroy several major bunkers in the most heavily fortified sector that was on the roads that led from Leningrad to Vyborg. And when they destroyed these bunkers, the preparations were completed, and the massive offensive started on the 11th of February, 1940. And the Soviet troops managed to capture several other major so-called millionaire bunkers, which blocked the path for the Red Army. So the Mannerheim line was broken through almost in the middle of it, and of the Karelian Isthmus, and the Finns started retreating to their second line of defenses, which was not as strong, and the Red Army already had enough heavy artillery to break through the second line. Still, the offensive was not going at a very rapid pace, but the Red Army started advancing. By the beginning of March, the Red Army was already on the outskirts of Vyborg, and heavy fighting broke out on the outskirts of Vyborg. The Finns were still holding their positions. The Red Army even managed to capture a small bridgehead on the other side of the Bay of Vyborg by crossing the ice and of the bay, of the frozen bay, and being a foothold in this area. It was kind of isolated by the Finns, but still it was the presence of the Red Army troops in the rears was already like quite dangerous. And after like about a week of fighting, like from the beginning of March, the Finns decided to start negotiating with Moscow, because they realized that they were like running out of reserves, running out of time. The Western aid that they hoped for was coming, and they decided to negotiate a deal with Stalin. I guess you all know the end results of this deal, so that the former Vyborg province became part of Soviet Union with certain alterations in the border, but basically the border was about like 70 kilometers to the west of Vyborg after that. And this is how the war ended. I mean, if you need me to elaborate on this.
How much territory did Russia the Soviet Union gain in terms of getting Karelia, sort of gaining more than they were asking for?
Well, basically, they got a small piece of, but quite important part of land in the very far north. I'll speak from start telling by going from north to south. They got this little piece of land, which was extremely important because of its nickel mines and the Petsovo. And then they got some land in central, like North Karelia, and the most important part was the area around the Ladoga Lake, because the Ladoga Lake was kind of split in two. Like the Finns were in the north, the Soviet Union was in the south. The Finns were diagonally split between the Soviet Union and Finland. So the Ladoga became the inner lake of the Soviet Union. And, well, the biggest prize was the town of Vyborg, which, the Soviet Union gained in its possession. And also the Soviet Union rented a military base from Finland for 50 years. There was a 50 years rent agreement. The military base in Hanko. Hanko is a small peninsula in the very west of Finland, very southwest. Which occupied a strategic position at the entrance into the Gulf of Finland. The Soviet Union arranged a military base there. After the war, it brought its heavy artillery to Hanko in order to shell enemy ships trying to enter the Gulf of Finland like this. So these were the main, and also Finland was obliged not to enter any hostile alliances or cooperate with militarily with any countries that were hostile to the Soviet Union. It's like that.
So before we went live, you made a very brief comparison with Khrushchev gifting Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic within the Soviet Union, much like the Tsar gave Vyborg or Vyborg to the Duchy of Finland. Can you sort of elaborate on this very briefly?
Well, okay, so basically when Finland became part of Russia after the Russo-Swedish War of 1809, Sweden ceded, what is modern-day Finland to Russia, to the Russian Empire. And at the time, the border, just before the Russo-Swedish War of 1809, the border between Russia and Sweden was almost in the same place as today. So Vyborg was part of Russia. It was a Russian town since 1710, and legally it became part of Russia after the peace treaty with Sweden in 1721. So it was a Russian town, quite close to the Finnish border, but still Russian. But after annexing Finland to Russia in 1809, Alexander I, first of all, he gave the Finns the constitution, so it became a semi-autonomous state within the Russian Empire. And besides giving the constitution, he also gave them, as a kind of a welcome gift, he gave them the Vyborg province because he thought it was kind of a nice thing to do. It would make him more popular with the newly conquered subjects. And he also thought that there were quite a lot of Finns living on the territory of the Vyborg province, so it would be a nice thing to to join Finns with the Finns. And back then, this gesture did not mean that much because, Finland was still part of the Russian Empire. It was like some kind of little administrative rearrangements of territorial control between different subjects of the empire. It didn't matter that much. And that's approximately what Khrushchev thought back in the 1950s when he gave Crimea to Ukraine. He thought it was just, it's quite close to the Ukraine, so why wouldn't it be part of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic? It's still part of the Soviet Union, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, why not? But this decision had huge consequences. Yeah, in 1939 and in 2022. And another thing is that I'm pretty sure that the Soviet Union would have not started a war with Finland in 1939 had Vyborg remained part of the Russian Empire and like consequently part of the Soviet Union. Because back then it was not really actively seeking a major war, it was relatively cautious, like speaking of the European countries, and there was no like logical military rationale to start this war with Finland, considering the general event in Europe.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the Soviet Union was a new state, and it perceived itself as being surrounded by many hostile powers. In many cases, it wasn't recognized until the 1930s, so it was definitely very conservative in this regard. So I think people kind of forget when they look at the size of the USSR and they look at its performance in World War II, they kind of forget how conservative it was in that earlier period. But yeah, definitely, if you guys are ever ruling a large empire or a country, make sure not to transfer territories within administrative borders, because you might be setting a ticking time bomb, as these two Russian leaders have demonstrated to us. So my next question is to either both of you or either one of you. The Red Army had a high casualty rate as compared to Finland. What impact did the perception of its performance in the Winter War have on World War II, perhaps on Hitler, if any? And of course, we can also link this to modern propaganda. So which one of you would like to address this? I'm not sure which one is more... Okay, let's go with Andrej.
Okay, this is one of the major toposes, which are, when people still talk about the Finnish Winter War, they mostly talk about casualty rates of the Red Army. Like everything else is simply ignored or put under the rug. Only this is matter, and this is one very specific, I would say, Anglo-centric perspective, which completely ignores the casualty rates of the other side or the damages incurred on the other side. The only thing which is important for the Anglo-Americans is how many Russians are killed in the process. Now, talking about actual casualty rates, it's a little bit difficult because there have been uses and misuses of different sources and different numbers. Now, in the aftermath of the war, I think it was Molotov, I think, that officially came up with the numbers, which were about 50,000 killed Red Army soldiers, which was obviously not in correlation with the actual casualty rates. However, this figure was being used for a long while because it was obviously inconvenient to admit larger casualties. However, after Stalin's death, during the Khrushchev's anti-Stalinist posture, he did completely U-turn, and he mentioned, I think at one point he mentioned officially 270,000 killed Red Army soldiers. And his memoirs, he talked even about million or something like that. It's completely ludicrous. The actual number is probably somewhere in between. I think that most of various sources which I've been acquainted with, the Georgy Krivoshev estimate of about 125,000 is probably the most correct, give or take, maybe 130, maybe 140, but we're talking about this kind of numbers. A large number of them weren't even the casualties of actual combat, but people who froze to death when they lost logistic lines and were being cut off and simply froze in such conditions. It's still a huge number. I mean, this is the larger number of people killed in 3 months of combat, a little bit over 3 months, than right now in almost three years from the Russian side, speaking, in Ukraine. So the intensity of it is quite high. On the other hand, the Finns also didn't have easy going. I mean, it wasn't one-sided affair. They officially acknowledged 25,000 or so people were killed in combat, which is actually considerably higher according to proportion of troops and proportion of population when you compare Finnish and Soviet Union population. So it hurt them more in relative numbers in a big picture. Because Soviet Union being, I think it was something like, maybe Alexander would know better, something like 170 million people at the time was inhabitants of Soviet Union. I mean, obviously they could much more easily replenish population losses from the existing population, which was proportionally young at the time. Then the Finns could replace their 25,000 people. Nevertheless, it was still a considerable amount of casualties, and the whole propaganda picture, which was formed from the journalists coming from the West covering the war, it had a significant impact of the perspective on Soviet Union, especially from the German side. Hitler actually did made a comment that I think it is in Hitler's tabletop conversations that he said that well, if the small Finns, as the British propaganda presented them, if they managed to kick Russians in the face in such a manner, imagine what we will do when we eventually invade. So on the other hand, I mean, this is a two-edged sword. On the other hand, it emboldened Hitler to attack, but he would attack anyway, sooner or later. Maybe not in 1941, maybe it would be in 1942 or 43, but it was going to happen anyhow. On the other hand, the relatively poor performance, especially in this first phase of the war of the Red Army, sort of sobered up Stalin, and this prompted him to release large number of officers which were purged from the army, but they were still alive. They were either in gulags, or there was in house arrests, or civilians, or something like that. So they were all immediately brought back into the army, and it prompted a more serious approach to current reforms, which were already in place. So it also meant that the Red Army was in a better position in 1941, when the war actually broke out, than it would be otherwise without the Finnish war. So it's difficult to give like an objective assessment of which one of those two side effects was more impactful, because the war would happen anyhow, and as I said, the Red Army was in a better position than it would be without the war, casualties aside. But there's this very strange obsession with dead Russians especially from the British media, which is obviously even today very much alive. And I remember back in 2008, there has been, when the thing was happening in Georgia, there was this very strong reminiscence. Very, very often there would be referencing the Finnish war, like the Finns won the war and not lost it. And this is kind of a ideological model from especially from the British, which they try to impose on various different East European or Caucasian countries as I don't know, like it's a good thing to poke a bear and get mauled in turn. I mean, nobody will. Finns lost it, and they lost manpower, they lost the territory, and they were lucky that Stalin did have a sort of respect for them, and for Mannerheim apparently personally, in the Second World War, and that they weren't punished even much more worse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe Alexander will want to continue on with the Second World War.
Yes, thank you for explaining that, and we love to call out British propaganda on this channel or anywhere where I can open my mouth, because that's one of my hobbies, even more so than American propaganda in some cases. So what I'd like to hear from Alexander is, you mentioned that one of the resolutions to the Winter War was that Finland was not really supposed to cooperate with Germany in any shape or form. What was the Finnish role in World War II, and specifically when it comes to your area of specialization, which is the Siege of Leningrad? And maybe if you can talk about Mannerheim in that context, if applicable, that would be very helpful for our audience.
Well, Finland, naturally, they pledged not to cooperate, but that's exactly what they did in 1940. And when the plan for the Barbarossa offensive was finally approved by Hitler in December 1940, Finland was mentioned as one of the countries that would take part in the war. So there's there was a certain like amount of Finnish propaganda which said that they joined the war at the very last moment, and nothing was like decided. But well, if Hitler mentions Finnish participation in the war of like half a year before it's actually started, so maybe it does mean something. Anyway, the Finns started actively exchanging intelligence with the Germans. They started coordinating their plans, and the way the war started is that on the 22nd of June, the Germans used Finnish bases, air bases, and naval bases. They used Finnish submarines planted mines at the fairways of the near the coast of the Baltic Sea, like right next to the Soviet territory. And the Finns still remained kind of inactive for about 3 days. They did not immediately declare war on the Soviet Union, but on the 25th of June, well, the Soviet Union decided to bomb the airfields that the Germans used on the Finnish territory, and they know all known locations of German bases. Naturally, a lot of bombs fell far away from their destinations, and there were tiny casualties. I think almost like no one got really killed, but the Finns used this as a casus belli for declaring the war on the Soviet Union. And surprisingly enough, the entire army was already mobilized and ready to start their offensive on day one, but the Finns still did not rush into action immediately. There was some like border like skirmishes, but nothing like of note until the 9th of July. So the Finns, that's what I think. The Finns decided to wait until the Germans would advance deep into the Soviet territory, and they would see they would wanted to see whether the whole German invasion plan was going well. And by the 9th of July, the situation looked like perfect for the Germans. They were just some of the German high commanders even noted in like diaries or exchanges that the war is as good as won, literally. And that's when the Finns decided to make their move in order to snatch their piece of the big pie that was the Soviet Union, and started their offensive in Karelia. The way it made the whole situation worse, well, I mean, the situation was already bad for the Soviet Union as it started at the high command of the military command of the Northern Front, which was the front which defended Leningrad. It stretched from the coast of the Arctic Ocean all the way to the Baltic states. The high command started dragging the military units that were located on the Finnish border to the area around Pskov or like Estonia that was still free from the Germans at the time. So basically, the border, by the time the Finns attacked, the border it's not like it was denuded of Soviet troops, but a lot of troops were moved to fight against the Germans. So it made things much easier for the Finns. And this Soviet high command still had to drag units from the Finnish border in order to stop the much more dangerous and massive German invasion. So the Finns had a rather easy time reaching the coast of the Ladoga Lake on the Karelian Isthmus, and by the end of August, when the situation was getting catastrophic around Leningrad and the German troops broke through the last major defensive line on their way to Leningrad, the Luga line, and the Finns made their move around Vyborg, and this is when the so-called Vyborg catastrophe happened, as it was described in the Soviet war history, as 3 divisions were trapped around Vyborg. Some of their men could be evacuated, but the Finns took a lot of prisoners, and even the divisions that got evacuated had to abandon their heavy equipment. So this was like the local Soviet Dunkirk on a minor scale. And the Finns advanced all the way to, speaking of the Karelian Isthmus, they advanced all the way to Leningrad, and the Finnish troops basically formed the northern parts of the encirclements. They maintained the northern part. They stopped right next to the Soviet line of fortifications. It was a massive line of bunkers built in the early 1930s as a line of defense against not so much Finland, because Finland was not seen as a major military threat. The main danger coming from Finland was that it was seen as a country eager to offer its territory to imperial powers, and basically this is where the invasion of Britain, France, any other like major imperialist power could have come from. I mean, as it was seen in the early 1930s before Hitler's rise to power. And that's when the Soviet Union built most of these bunkers, and the Finns stopped right next to them. So they did not want to advance that much further for a number of reasons. First of all, they did not have heavy siege artillery to pulverize these bunkers into dust, and that was basically an essential thing before like trying to assault Leningrad itself. They did not want, like, literally to pull chestnuts out of the fire for the Germans, because the city, according to the Finnish-German agreements, that they, according to the arrangements they made before the war, Leningrad was supposed to become German territory, and they did not want to assault this massive city that was full of barricades, bunkers, bricked in windows with like firing slits, and lots of like men ready to defend the city to the last breath. They did not want to do that because the Germans had to. It was the German job to capture the town, and then the Finns would just quietly advance to this already dead city and occupy the territory along the Neva River. So the border between the Nazi Reich and Finland was supposed to pass along the Neva River. And another thing, there's a huge misconception, which I encounter like every now and then in Western histories of the war, and not just the Western history, but actually some Russians are even prone to falling for this. It's the completely false claim that Finland only advanced to its own borders. Well, this is complete bullshit. Even if you look at the map of the Karelian Isthmus, where the Finns did not seize a lot of territory, they advanced like 10, 20 kilometers further into the Soviet territory. But actually, in eastern Karelia, the Finns seized a huge part of territory which had never belonged to Finland before that. Finland or Sweden, even. So they captured the town of Petrozavodsk, which is a Russian town on the coast of the Onega Lake. That's the lake to the east of Ladoga. And the way they occupied this area was kind of similar to what the Nazis did. They established a number of prison camps for ethnic Russians. So there was a very clear segregated approach to the local population. They decided that the Russians, ethnic Russians, were politically unreliable, and they were basically put in prison camps. These camps were not like the Nazi death camps, where people would be sent to exterminate them in gas chambers or like slaughtered en masse. But the conditions the Russians were kept in were completely horrendous. So they could be in a way compared to what American prisoners of war experienced in Japanese POW camps. Because they were completely malnourished. Quite often they were beaten for any kind of misdemeanor, as it would be considered by the Finnish guards. You didn't bow to them, you didn't look the right way, you would get beaten. It's interesting that they had a very kind of Machiavellian policy on allowing the inmates of these camps to go outside. This was made to maintain the pretense that these camps were not that bad, but at the same time, prisoners could be executed for fleeing the camps. And it was up to the local guard to decide whether the person was just leaving this barbed wire camp to go into the woods to pick berries, or whether this person was fleeing. So there were a lot of arbitrary shootings. It was it sounds really weird, but that's the way it was. The number of civilians who died in these camps is estimated to be from 4 to 10,000. So no proper records were kept, but this is the rough estimate. The number of ethnic Russians that passed through these camps was approximately in different time periods, it was if you take all the people who were like put in camps, this is about 40,000. But in the initial phase of the war, in the first year of the war, it was way less. And the greatest mortality rate was in the first winter of the war, 1941, 1942. The death rates of the inmates of these camps was actually similar to the death rates of civilians in besieged Leningrad. So the Finns claim that they had no food for themselves, but it's not like I've heard of any massive cases of starvation in Finland itself. So basically, the Finns still had enough food for their civilians. And well, it's a kind of, I would say, like it's a case of maliciously criminal negligence like this. So that's the way I can describe it. Because the Finns, okay, they did not have a lot of food, but they did not want to kind of walk not an extra mile, but make an extra little step to feed the innocent civilians who were kept in these camps. The situation with the Russian prisoners of war was even worse because they were. Naturally, they were kept under much worse conditions, and their mortality rate was it was lower than the mortality rate of Soviet prisoners of war in Nazi captivity, but it was about something like about 30% of them died in Finnish prison camps. So which is a huge number considering, and this kind of undermines the claim that Finland was like a completely like democratic, and when we say democratic, it means humanitarian state, which conforms with all the international regulations on maintaining the prisoners of war and on keeping up the standards. And it's interesting that in 1942, a Swiss doctor like Hugo Petermann wrote an article, and he wrote a number of articles, and he basically started a massive awareness campaign about the poor situation of Soviet prisoners of war. It actually reached the ears of Americans, who made a kind of a reprimand to Sweden, and to Finland. And it's interesting that while England declared war on Finland, America did not. It's another kind of curious bit in this war, although they were allies with the Soviet Union. So that's another thing is that the Finns renamed the town of Petrozavodsk to Anis Linna. Anis is the name of the Onega Lake in Finland, and Linna is fortress. So basically, the Onega fortress. They started renaming the towns, which naturally meant that they kind of wanted this territory to become part of the Greater Finland. Although later they tried to deny this claim because formally the Finnish parliament did not sign the instrument of annexation, of this region to Greater Finland, but actually de facto it was being annexed because the children who studied at the schools on the occupied territories were taught about the ideas of Greater Finland. The children who were like ethnic Karelians, or the few Russians who were seen to be politically reliable, the tiny number of them. Even the Nazis had there a number of Russians who turned codes or who offered their services to them, and they were used as useful idiots to kind of advance their agenda. But generally, the Karelian kids, as the kinship folk for the Finns, they were taught they were raised as future citizens of the Greater Finland, like this. Well, this is speaking of the occupation.
So, Andrej, do you want to weigh in on the topic of World War II in any way?
Yes, I do. First of all, I would have to say that there is a disconnect between correlation of a formal political system and its supposedly humanitarian, attitudes. Some of the very worst crimes and largest crimes committed in modern human history have been committed by the nominally democratic states. So it doesn't really matter all that much. I will want to shed some light on one of the events which didn't happen but almost happened. And this is the intervention of the Franco-British troops in Finland, or better to say in Scandinavia, because Finland was just a pretext, not an end goal in itself. And this is something which was supposedly to take part in March or April of 1940. So they took some time. The initial proposition for this kind of intervention from the French and British actually came at the beginning, I think, beginning of February. So this was after this initial phase of the Red Army, which was more or less unsuccessful, which emboldened them. The context is important here. Now, at this time, there was this so-called phony war happening on the Western Front, which meant that there wasn't really actual combat being done between the Franco-British troops and the Germans. They were in a state of war, but everybody was sitting on its own side of the border, and there wasn't really like any movement or serious combat. There were some small skirmishes between patrols and things like that, but nothing important. Which meant that there was considerable amount of strategic reserves from the Franco-British side, which could be deployed at some other fronts. And there was this total hysteria. I think that only the beginning of special military operation in 2022 is comparable to hysteria which was being pumped up especially by the British, also to the extent French and the American media at the time. Soviet Union was also kicked out of the League of Nations at the first things of the order. So these things are very familiar, with current affairs. But what they did, they once they were sort of certain that it wouldn't be like a parade walk for the Red Army, that it's supposedly stuck in a Karelia, they conjured up this idea to sort of help out the Finland by sending them troops. Now, obviously, being in a state of war with Germany, they couldn't do it through Baltic Sea, and they declined to do it from the port of Petsamo, far north, because it was too dangerous to do so. But more importantly, that they had the other idea in mind. The actual idea wasn't really to help Finland at all. The idea was actually to bring in Norway and Sweden to war with Germany, to provoke Germans to invade Norway and Sweden. Because the initial proposition was for 100,000 British troops and 35,000, I think, or so French troops were supposed to be sent to this expedition. And because both Norwegian and Swedish government, for obvious reasons, declined the request to allow their military presence, because Germans stated, and everybody knew it was like in the public, that in case of the Franco-British troops coming into Scandinavia, Germans will militarily interfere. Now, why is it important? Because at the time, the Swedish mines, metallic ore mines, were about half of the entire steel production. They were being provided by them, German steel production, as I said, and the most quality steel was coming from Sweden, not from Germany itself. Germany had their own ore deposits, but these were of lesser quality, not for high tech gear like large caliber guns and things like that. For this, Swedish steel was used, and Sweden was, on one hand, it was satisfied to continue doing the business deals with the Third Reich. On the other hand, they were also being intimidated by the Germans, so there's a little bit of both in question. But they knew that in case of the British troops being present on their territory, they would be invaded by the Germans. And something like this happened a little bit later with the Norwegians. So this sort of dragged on this military planning. And from the available documents, it is known that actually only smaller part of these troops were supposed to actually reach Finland itself. Only token force, totally out of proportion to actual fighting the Red Army. Most of these troops would be deployed in Norway and Sweden, expecting Germans to come forward to invade. But nevertheless, from the British perspective, it would still be good enough, because they would disrupt the supply of ores to Germany. Never mind that both Norway and Sweden will be completely devastated by the war, which had nothing to do with their national interests. So this is kind of a repeating pattern of the British foreign policy, dragging various different countries to their own war against their better interests. Same thing happened in 1940 with Greece, and they almost initially invaded Norway in 1940, because now this is something which even in Norway people know about this, but they don't really like to talk about it because it's politically inconvenient. British devised this plan called R4 for invasion of Norway, precisely to cut this transportation of ores coming to Germany, and they already laid some naval minefields in the Norwegian territorial waters to disrupt this transport within territorial waters of a neutral country, which prompted Germans to actually go. They only invaded Norway; they didn't go for Sweden, because only British troops were present in Norway at the time. But essentially, British dragged Norwegians into war against their interests and against their wishes. Now, of course, once they were invaded initially by the Germans, they had to join the Allied side, got conquered, and essentially the Germans walked the floor with this expeditionary corps, jointly by the French and the British, completely kicked them out, and they barely managed to evacuate and to safety of the British Isles, only due to superiority of British fleet. But it was heavily. They were being deported from Narvik, and they lost a lot of prisoners. Nevertheless, they lost a lot of ships. It was complete debacle. So it's completely ludicrous to imagine how they were expecting that this entire endeavor would be sustained in case of things actually going the way they were planning to do. And it's obviously very similar to the current situation when, again, British and the French are going with this, completely ludicrous ideas of sending troops to Ukraine, completely inadequate in both numbers and equipment and sustainment. But nevertheless, there is this precedent in which they are just itching for the fight against vastly superior opponent without any a rhyme of reason. They couldn't do it in 1940, and they couldn't do it today. But it doesn't stop them. So there is this kind of a deep irrationality in a British mode of thinking about just wanting to stick it up to the Russians, no matter what.
So you're taking it beyond ideology, and you're claiming that it's just irrational. It's not even ideologically explained to keep engaging in these adventures, so to speak.
Yes. I mean, back in 1919, Alexander knows this. French were already in Odessa for about, I think, 2 months or so, and they were kicked out by the locals. By the locals, not even by the Red Army, but by the local uprising. So it didn't end well for them then, and it's very hard to imagine how it would end for them again if they would, engage them, especially not confronted by the locals, but by the proper nuclear armed army. But yeah, there is this kind of this is more of the British than the French thing. This kind of impossible schemes that they're just being thrown around. Sometimes they work, sometimes they nearly work, like Churchill's plan of the Dardanelles operation in the First World War, which was nearly a success, and it wasn't as bad as failure as political and later historiography claims to be, but it was failure nevertheless. But more often than not, they're simply just they're coming from a position of the weaker side in a geopolitical struggle. And there is constant pressure for them to kind of equalize this by these asymmetrical approaches, mostly by sacrificing other people's lives to suit their needs. I mean, when you go back to the Napoleonic Wars, they did the very same thing with the Portuguese and the Spanish. And of course, the famous British gold, which was pouring all across Europe, funding other peoples to fight against Napoleon. So there is this long line of the precedents coming from centuries in continental interventions from the British side.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the French go in Odessa in 1919, I think they're pretty fed up with World War I. And so by then, from what I've read, they were ready to mutiny. So it was like they didn't want to be there either. So the fact that the locals did not want them, I think, is just the icing on the cake. So to wrap up this episode, I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about the long-term consequences of the Winter War, whether it pertains to actual relationship between Finland and the USSR during the Cold War, or maybe today, or when it comes to the, our favorite topic, propaganda wars. So who would like to tackle which side of the question? You don't have to cover it. We could do it pretty briefly because we've been going for a while, and I know it's getting late, especially in St. Petersburg.
So basically, I'll just speak briefly about Soviet-Finnish relations after the war. The Soviet Union managed to force Finland to sign a peace agreement in 1944 with its offensive. I won't go far into detail, although this detail is quite curious about how the Finns struck a deal with the Germans and double-crossed them after that. But that's a different topic to discuss. In the end of the day, the Soviet Union signed an armistice with Finland, and then the peace treaty in 1947. And according to this peace treaty, Finland had to pay huge reparations to the Soviet Union. It established a naval base right next to Helsinki in Porkala. The distance to Helsinki was something like 50-something kilometers, so it was very extremely close. It was like a dagger to the neck of the Finnish government. And it's curiously enough, this agreement helped the Finns restore to develop their industry, because since Finland had no money to pay with, their factories had to pay the Soviet Union back with their goods, and since they didn't have any advanced industry, the Soviet Union was already kind of readily prepared market for them, although this market was meant for supplying the Soviet Union, for providing the Soviet Union with the compensation for the damages. Still, even after that, the Finns produced, I would say by European standards, second-rate goods, and the Soviet Union eagerly bought them because the Finland promised to be a completely neutral country. So there was the so-called policy of Finlandization, it maintained its democratic institutions, and it was not part of the Soviet bloc. But at the same time, it's stayed away from all Western alliances, from any cooperation with NATO, America, or any other countries that were hostile to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union paid Finland back not only by kind of being friendly in all ways and buying Finnish goods, and this allowed the Finnish economy to prosper in the 50s and 60s. It also, and this is something that a lot of Russian people do not know, these facts started getting uncovered to the broad public literally a couple of years ago, when the relationship with Finland drastically worsened, and you know why. The Soviet government decided to suppress practically all memory of the Finnish concentration camps, the ones that I've already described. There were mentions of fascist crimes on the Karelian territory, but there were no memorials, no big monuments to the victims of these camps. The people who wanted to write dissertations or theses or books on the subject were told to kind of slow down. And the association, the first meeting of the Association of Finnish Prisoners of War took place in the late 1980s, and it was actually not sponsored, but organized by the Finnish writer Seppälä, who wrote about the crimes of the Finnish military administration on the Karelian territory. And literally up to the last few years, there was very little information about the Finnish prison camps in Karelia, and personally, I've met a number of people, not a lot, but still, there are still, seemingly well-educated Russian people who have no idea that Finland participated in the war. And the only explanation is that it was never taught at schools. It was skirted around at schools or like in popular stories about the war. If you look at Soviet military encyclopedia, you would definitely see that the Finnish troops invaded, but that's whoever cares about encyclopedias or like big tomes of whatever. The way it was told at schools, the way it was shown in the media. For example, there's the super famous Soviet movie, which became, by the way, it became a huge hit in China. The Dawns Are Quiet Here, about a group of girls, like the anti-crowd gunners. The plot of this whole movie takes place on the territory of Karelia. Neither in the movie nor in the novel that the movie is based upon. First German division, the nearest German units, and the author describes the place, the approximate area where this like anti-aircraft like personnel were located, and the nearest German unit was within like 200 kilometers away. So basically, it was like, and they did not even discuss the possibility of the Finns appearing there. So you might imagine the scale of this like government's organized suppression of memory. That's the like in one of the most popular Soviet movies about the war, which takes place right next to the Finns. There's not a single mention of any Finns at all. And this is the reason why a lot of Russians were kind of shocked that Finland wanted to join the NATO, because while the Soviet Union the Soviet government, the communist government, did everything to suppress people's memory of the war, the Finns, well, you know, the Soviet government, when they signed this armistice, they also had a clause like the peace treaty. They had a clause which forbade, which ordered the Finns to ban all like nationalist and fascist organizations. But you know, you can ban an organization, but you can't prevent people from discussing it like at their whatever meetings, you know, like it's or it was not taught at schools, but the sentiment remains, and the free access to information remains, and a lot of, well, I would say quite a lot of Finns harbored ill feelings towards the Soviet Union. So there was a huge disparity in the attitudes between the Soviet people and the Russian people, who kind of inherited whatever mentality the Soviet people had, and the Finns, because when it was like a rude awakening for a lot of Russians, like, wow, the Finns, they're so nice, they have movie trolls, and they have like Finnish coffee that we imported. What happened? How come? I mean, like, have we ever fought a single war against Finland? Wow, really? That's a sincere
That's
reaction.
because they don't listen to Finnish metal, and they don't know songs about the Winter War like I do.
Well, yeah. So here you are.
Okay, Andrej, would you like to take over on this topic? Do you want to talk about the Western sort of this war in Western imagination, or, you know, make any other connections to propaganda initiatives coming from the UK or any other country that would apply here?
No, first of all, I would like to sort of go after Alexander. That I recently had this conversation with some friends of mine, precisely on the topic why have because what he described towards the Finns, and I would say even towards the Germans. Germans were never called as Germans; they were called as fascists. I mean, they weren't even fascists; they weren't even that; they were National Socialists. But of course, it was inconvenient to put the whole syntagm in place. The same thing happened here in Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia, after the Second World War, there was this notion that we have been invaded again by the fascists, which is in part true because Italians did take part in invasion, occupation, but that vast majority of crimes were committed either by the Germans, which weren't fascists and they were specifically Germans, or by their local allies, mostly the Croats, which had their own state. So you can argue, was the independent state of Croatia fascist or not, but it sort of misses the point. It was all done for political reasons, just like in the Soviet Union, because everybody wanted to keep sort of relationships with Finland, with Germany, and it was much more easy to obfuscate the matter by just blaming it on some abstract fascists. So there's that. Also, Yeah, I mean, as I said, there's this very weird perception which sort of lingers on still, that somehow Finns somehow won the war, which they obviously didn't. They lost it. They paid considerable price for it, both in manpower and in territory. And to be perfectly honest, considering the events in the Second World War, well, in continuation war, as they call it, I mean, I think they got pretty lightly, when considering both. I read the anecdote, which I cannot really vouch if it's true or not, but apparently in 1945, Stalin personally held a toast for the bravery of Finnish soldiers. I don't know. I read it only in one source, so it might or might not be true. Anyhow, yes, Finland was pretty leniently treated. Finalization, which is a dirty word in American political vocabulary, is probably the best thing which could theoretically happen to Finland, because it not only protected them from the fallout of the First Cold War, it also meant that because they couldn't, they did not heavily invest in their own armed forces, which opened up the budget for social development, which is not something which most European countries, both from East or from West, could easily do, because they were pressured from West or from East to actually heavily involved in their military forces. So it was, objectively speaking, the best thing that happened to them. However, I have one question that if I ever had the opportunity to talk with somebody in power in Russia, I would like to pose them, because one of the peace treaties clauses in 1944 was this this prevention of Finland joining ever again any kind of military alliance against Soviet Union. And because Russia is the legal successor of Soviet Union, legally speaking, Russia could completely justifiably declare war on Finland in 2022 when it joined NATO. And why didn't? Even before that, I mean, before it was accepted and everything else was done. Was it just a sheer inconvenience? Perhaps. But this kind of a lenient attitude toward Finland is coming around to bite Russia in, yes. Because, yes, you fought a war of aggression. We're talking about 1941, not 1939. You lost it. You signed a peace treaty. You were obliged. And yet you renegated against this. So Russia right now is fully in a legal capacity to declare war without anybody saying anything against it from a legal standpoint.
I don't even have anything to say to that, because I'm afraid to think of the consequences of Russia actually pursuing that course of action. Alexander, what do you think?
Just a couple of corrections. So when I spoke about the Finns being named fascist, there's a big difference. So whenever Germans were mentioned, they were called interchangeably Germans and fascists, or German fascists. There was practically always a mention of Germans, like their ethnicity or their national belonging. Whenever it came to the Finns, sometimes I have to, when I read a Soviet book on the on certain soldiers who fought against the Germans, for example. So I read about this soldier who fought against the Germans, and then there's a mention. And then he fought the fascists in summer 1944 near Leningrad. I think there were no Germans before that. There were Germans mentioned there. Germans, and then suddenly it's fascists. Well, naturally, these were the Finns when the Soviet offensive started in June 1944. So there's not a single Soviet movie, where the Finns would be shown as the Finns wearing Finnish uniform and fighting against the Soviet Union. And whenever the Soviet authors had to, they just could not miss it, they had to mention the Finns fighting the war, they called them exclusively fascists. So it was only in military historical books, that were dedicated historical books, for that were normally read by the soldiers in military academies, that they would mention the Finns as the Finns. Another thing is that the Mannerheim never made Stalin never told to the Finnish soldiers. He made a formal sent formal greetings to Mannerheim, as the leader at the time, but not to the Finnish soldier. But that's it.
Marcelo, I know you've been trying to jump in. Do you want to jump in? Marcelo, can you hear us? Did you want to jump in?
Sorry, I had to close the audio because somehow I still have echo coming from Andrej and Alexandra. The video is good. I checked on YouTube several times, but I don't know. Sometimes I just don't know what the hell is going on here.
Did you want to contribute before we wrap it up? Did you want to contribute with?
There were no questions today, but several very interesting comments, especially from people that, well, at least claim they are Finns. So I will tend to believe. And I think the most interesting part of the comments was exactly about, when studying the wars inside Finland or whatever, people study outside of, Finland and Russia. And I have a Paraguayan friend, a very good friend of mine. And that was perhaps my first punch of reality in the nose. We were just, chit-chatting or stuff like that. And he said some stupid stuff. And I said, like, dude, I'm going to kick your ass like we did to Paraguay. And he was like, what the hell are you talking about? We won. And I was like, no, you didn't. No. And yeah, we won. And then I said, yeah, so why did you lost like 60% of your territory? Why did, a third of a fourth of your population was vanished? And then he kind of realized, damn, we lost. And that was a punch of reality for me because he studied his entire life that Paraguay won the Paraguayan War against Brazil, and that even though there was no sense whatsoever why he learned that, but. And I'm not saying that, Brazil won. No, I mean, you do the math. And the perception of people that, and I've seen that several times with people that actually study history by hobby, that they say, Finland won the Winter Wars. And how come? Well, Russia didn't win, didn't took everything from Finland. Well, but that's perhaps not the purpose of the war. Perhaps not. And when I see every day this with the guys in power in Washington, in Europe, everywhere, the media just showing, well, almost opening a risk. A table game and say, well, Russia didn't win because they didn't took Ukraine, or Russia didn't win because they didn't took Kiev in 3 days. Come on, dudes. And I think this perspective is extremely interesting. Someone wrote here in the comments, I learned more about history in the last 5 years than the previous 42 of my life. And I feel it. I told you guys before, 2-3 years ago, I had never heard about the Winter War in my life. And then I have I'm not a full picture. I'm getting a full picture today here, better full picture than I had till now. Someone from my channel wrote that this is the history class that we should be having in schools. This is one of the biggest purpose of my channels, and I know, of course, your channel as well, Nina. And I just wanted to, congratulate this fantastic chat. I'll have to rewatch it because I was very worried that things could break apart. But
you guys let us know if you want us to invite Alexander and Andrej back at some point to actually talk about World War II, because we've actually never covered World War II, and we might have to focus on particular features of the war because it's such a massive discussion. But you guys let us know in the comments, and we're now putting them on the spot, and now they're not going to be able to say no. This is my little trick. So so you let us know if you want them to be back, and hopefully we can do another collaboration in the future. Do you two want to say anything as the parting words, where to follow you? I know, Andrej, you like to keep your socials private and your media appearances are in Serbian. Serbian. I mean, perhaps there are some Serbians listening to us who could check you out. But Alexander, other than your Telegram and your website, is there anything anywhere else where people, do you post anything public on Facebook, or is that mostly not accessible?
Well, I do post it, but I mean, it's just in Russian. I mean, like I have I practically abandoned my English language channel. So I have a Russian channel which I update practically daily. So if you if you can read Russian, yeah, you're welcome. Or I don't know if you.
Well, these days everyone goes to when people are following Telegram to follow the war, they're just doing the auto translate on Telegram. So I think people would actually go and read your Telegram. I wasn't aware that you stopped updating the English one, so I need to get the Russian one from you. Andrej, anything from you? No. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. As you can see, I'm being joined by one of my beasts. So that means it's time to go. This was incredibly informative for me as well. For instance, I was not aware that the movie that Alexander referenced had anything to do with Finland. Of course, I watched it a long time ago, but it's a really famous movie. So I learned something new, even from my own history. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you in the next one.
Nina, talking about movies.
Yes, go ahead.
Talking about movies, there is a brilliant horror movie called Sauna, which deals precisely about this territory in 18th century, in the wars between Peter the Great and the Swedes. I mean, this is the background of the plot, but go check it out. If you like horror movies, definitely go check it out.
I like horror movies, but who made it? Which country?
I think it's Finnish production, but now these days everything is like a pan-European productions of sorts. So
sure,
but
I like slow Scandinavian and Finnish movies, so I think it would be, we'll definitely check it out. Thank you guys. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.
See you next one. Bye-bye. Thank you.